Welcome back. This is Geography 10, Lecture 12. I've made a couple of small alterations to these slides since I posted them. First, I took the first item off this list here on the title slide. Slavery continued. We're not going to talk about slavery today. We're going to talk about capitalism, what it means, and how it began. So we're going to focus in particular on the short reading that I asked you to do from Max Weber's General Economic History on what capitalism is, or how to define it, how to identify it. And then we're going to look at the conditions under which it first emerged as such in the form that Weber is thinking about it, which is to say England and the Industrial Revolution. The second change I've made is on this slide where it said map quizzes next week. That was true last week when I posted the lecture, but it's not true anymore. So it should read map quiz this week in sections, as I assume you already know. Sorry about that. To remind again, bibliographies are due in sections the week after spring break. I promised you today that I would talk a little bit about the bibliographies, and I will save some time at the end for that. The readings for today continue on in Bernstein, pages 252 to 265, and the Weber selections. On Thursday, next time we meet, we will watch a movie here in lecture called Black Gold, Wake Up and Smell the Coffee. That is a movie about coffee production, specifically in Ethiopia, today, in the present time, and it will provide an opportunity for us to think more about these definitional characteristics of capitalism and how it relates to other forms of production, other modes of production, social relations related to production. In other words, trying to emphasize that this process that I'm going to describe today is not simply a matter of history. It's not simply something that happened 200 years ago or so in England and somehow is done. It's actually something that continues to unfold even up to the present time. Are there any questions from last lecture? Any lingering unclarities? One other thing I might note, the midterms. We have nearly finished grading them, or rather the GSIs have nearly finished grading them, and our plan is to get them back to you on Thursday. We have to figure out how that works with the movie, but we'll figure something out. I also want to emphasize, before you even begin to start thinking about how to interpret your grade on the midterm, the grades for the entire semester for the class will be curved. And to that extent, your percentage grade on the midterm is only important insofar as it compares to what everyone else got, right? So when you see that number on your midterm, I will also put up on the board on Thursday, or whenever we give them back to you, the average grade and that sort of thing, the distribution of grades, so that you can compare your score to those of everyone else in the class. That is what matters. Furthermore, moreover, I hate trying to say those two words at the same time. Really, it's at the very end of the semester when we total all of the scores from all of the exams and assignments or whatever, quizzes, papers. That's the score that will be curved that will ultimately determine your grade. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. Reading's continued. When you come back from break, we'd like you to have read the section in your reader from Marx. That will continue the discussion of what capitalism means and how it came to be. For Thursday, the 1st of April, we'd like you to read George Orwell's famous essay, Shooting an Elephant, which will allow us to think about colonialism. And then Chapter 2 of Delaney for the 6th of April, and Atlas pages 42 to 69. All right. So thus far, from the first section of Bernstein, Bernstein offers us sort of two ways of defining capitalism, right? One of them is the production of goods for exchange to make a profit. And he says that is defining of capitalism. However, it's also something that is not unique to capitalism. In other words, there have been other societies, other economic formations in history that have also met that definition, but which are not capitalism. So you have other societies where there are markets, a division of labor, the production of goods for exchange, and the making of profit from the exchange of those goods. What you need, or what's more specific to capitalism, he says, are the social relations that accompany that form, that social organization. And he says the specific thing concerns the relationship of wage labor to the owners of the means of production. In other words, the division of society into a class of people who own the tools and other materials necessary to produce goods. And then on the other side, people who do not own those things, own simply their own labor time, labor power, and sell their labor power to the people who own those things and then work for them to produce goods. He says this is unique to capitalism. He says this involves also the notion or the reality that land and labor both are commodities. In other words, they can be bought and sold on the market just like other things. Okay? That's not unfamiliar to us. We're used to that. We're so used to it that it might strike us as scarcely worth mentioning. But it is historically unique, and it actually took a great deal of time and struggle for that to become the case, even in only parts of the world. And there are parts of the world in which those conditions, in fact, to this day, do not obtain. It's not the case that land and labor are simply things you can buy in many parts of the world. So we have to think about how those conditions came to be in the first instance, so where did they first come into play, and we have to think about why or how they became a kind of self-perpetuating, self-expanding system. In other words, if it happened in one place at one time, fine, so what? That wouldn't necessarily be that noteworthy. However, they came together in that place and time and proceeded to spread and become the dominant way of organizing social relations between people, land, resources, and time throughout much of the world. So how did that happen? Max Weber, we've met him already, right? He's the interesting, erudite, somewhat strange German sociologist from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He gave us the definition of the state. He also gave us the definition of nation that we've been working with. He also, as I mentioned before, read more or less everything that was available at the time he was living about economic history. And he wrote a book called The General Economic History, and the reading is from that book. And in it, he provides us his definition of capitalism, which is slightly different, perhaps from Bernstein, but not incompatible with Bernstein. He says it's a society in which rational, calculating, industrial provision of human needs predominates. he has a very specific, detailed notion of what rational and calculating mean. What do you think he means by rational and calculating? Anybody read other Max Weber? He's one of these people who wrote something about just about anything you can think of in sociology, the study of society. He wrote books about religion. He wrote books about power and authority. Anybody know, when he says rational, what does he not mean? Yes? Okay. Means and ends. Rationality for Weber means that you undertake the pursuit of specific defined objectives in a rational fashion, aiming simply to do it as efficiently and as logically as you can. He describes 3 bases for authority in the world. He says there is traditional authority, in which leaders have the authority to lead and to tell people what to do simply because that's the way it's always been done, right? It's a tradition. It's what everyone's used to. It may or may not be based on anything else besides the sort of status and authority vested in tradition. He says that's not what capitalism is about. Capitalism, in fact, tends to erode or get rid of traditional forms of authority precisely because they're not rational enough. What if the traditional leader happens to be somebody who's just, incompetent? What if the traditional leader says, it rains because this spirit medium does certain dances at a certain time of year, and the rain is what keeps us all alive, so you have to obey me and this spirit person because we bring the rain. And then the rain fails. And he says, no, I'm still in charge. And you say, well, wait a minute, you're supposed to bring the rain. He says, well, I'm still in charge. And the people say, well, that doesn't make any sense. The rational impulse would say, we're going to get rid of this person. We're going to put somebody in charge on a basis that makes more sense. Another form he describes of authority and power is charismatic, in which the leader promises certain kinds of a certain future, and it's based solely in that leader's sort of personality. It's a magnetic personality. It draws people to follow and obey, and they get caught up in this person, and sort of whatever this person says is what should happen. It doesn't matter if he says the one thing on Tuesday and a different thing completely on Friday. Who cares? He's the charismatic leader. Weber sees a lot of this in the history of the world as an important kind of authority, something that makes people do what other people say they should do. And he says, this is also not rational. There's all kinds of room for irrationality in charismatic leadership. So the third form he offers is rational authority, in which you have a clearly defined goal and rules, and those rules apply across the board as such, and they fit together in a logical way. You don't have 2 sets of rules that are inconsistent with each other. You make them all fit, and they're consistent in time. And at that point, the authority is based on the notion that this makes sense. This makes logical sense. It meets our interests in a logical way. It's efficient. And the sort of bureaucratic organization of government agencies in this country and in much of the world, to the extent that it's rational, and sometimes it's not, fits this Weberian notion of authority and power in the modern world. So in this case, what we have is the application of those kinds of principles to the production of goods in an industrial fashion. And we'll talk more about what industrial means as the lecture goes on. And his point here in this essay is to say that this is the predominant way of providing goods in a capitalist society. It's not the only way. It's not that there aren't also things made for our needs that aren't made this way. But the predominant way is rational, calculating industrial provision of human needs. He says without it, the whole economic system must collapse. And this is actually how he distinguishes capitalism from those other ancient societies in which you also had a division of labor and money and exchange and markets. He says in those settings, yeah, you had this to some degree, but if it were to be taken away from those societies, the societies themselves would not be completely transformed. They would not collapse. In a capitalist society, if you take this part out, you just sort of imagine as a thought experiment that suddenly this was gone. He says the whole society, the whole system would fall apart. The system has become dependent on this kind of production. And he says this dates to the mid-19th century. Any questions? So he offers us a list of presuppositions. And it might be worth noting that what Weber is doing here, the way he's generating these ideas, these insights, is in fact inductively, which is to say he's looking at all of the different examples of economic systems he can find in the literature, from all over the world, going all the way back in time as far as the documents can reach. And he's looking for commonalities. He's looking for patterns in what he sees. And he's distilling these patterns out of all of these examples. And he's asking, what are the conditions that are necessary in order for this particular system to obtain, to happen on the ground? In other words, what are the essential conditions of possibility for a capitalist system, which is a slightly different way of defining it than simply saying it equals X, right? Saying, okay, these are the features. What do you need in order for those features actually to exist? And he's arriving at it again by looking at all those settings in which this system exists and then asking, what do you need? What, if you took it away, would prevent this system from existing? So here they are. Number 1, appropriation of all physical means of production, land, apparatus, machinery, tools, etc., as disposable property of autonomous private industrial enterprises. You translate this into Marx's language, and it's simply, this is the ownership of the means of production as private property. Weber's got a whole bunch of other words here to sort of qualify it more carefully, right? It has to be disposable. It's not just that the means of production are owned by a certain group of people. It's that they, in fact, can get rid of them if they want to. They can sell them. They're disposable. You have complete control over them, not only in the sense that they're yours to use, but in the sense that they're yours to dispose of if you wish. And that includes land. It also effectively means labor. You can hire it and you can fire it. 2, freedom of the market. No irrational limitations on trading. Irrational. That would mean any restrictions not based in the sense of rationality that I just described. Again, like this, we're so accustomed to production being organized for the sake of production in a rational way, right? If we run into, I'm sure you've had this experience dealing with, say, the university bureaucracy, you run into something that just doesn't make sense. It seems irrational. Like, the point is to get this done. And you seem to have a system that prevents me from getting this done and causes us all to go around in circles, and it's irrational. Well, that's the kind of sense we're talking about here. We're generally accustomed, we get frustrated if we see production organized in a way that seems not to make any sense. We want to see it organized as efficiently as possible. Well, here we're talking about limitations on trading. And what he means is there shouldn't be any limitations on trading that don't make a kind of crisp, efficient, rational sense. And the key kinds of examples, or a key example we're going to talk about, is limitations on trading labor power. What kinds of limitations do we have in our society on who you can sell your labor power to, or who can hire whom to do what? Do we have limits on that? Yeah. Excuse me. We have child labor laws. We have laws that say you can't hire a 7-year-old to work in your factory. Is that a rational or irrational limitation on trading? It's rational, insofar as it's grounded in some definable notion of the larger good, right? It's not good for society to make 7-year-olds work in factories. It's not good for them individually, and it's not good for society insofar as the future well-being of the next generation is put at risk and prevented from going to school and doing other things that are, in the long run, more valuable to society. Can you think of any irrational constraints on the trade of labor in our society? What are some other examples of limitations? Can any old person be a doctor? There's a limitation on who can sell their labor power as a doctor, right? They have to be credentialed. They have to have been trained. They have to be certified. That's a limitation on their ability to trade, on everyone's ability to trade their labor power. You're not free to just declare yourself a doctor. But is it a rational one or an irrational one? It's rational. What if there were a law that said the only people who can be doctors are people whose fathers were doctors? Or that said if your father was a doctor, you have to be a doctor. It's decided before you're even born. Because your father or your mother is a doctor, you grow up, you'll be a doctor too. Is that rational or irrational? That's irrational. By Weber's definition, that is clearly irrational for any number of reasons. The son or daughter might not want to be a doctor. They might not be any good at being a doctor. Society might need more doctors or fewer doctors, and simply having to be limited to the offspring of doctors kind of constrains how many of them there can be. For no particularly clear, logical, instrumental reason either. It would just be clinging to some kind of tradition. Well, the societies that preceded capitalism in Europe, those kinds of rules were actually extremely commonplace, right? There were fairly strict, clear rules that said the only people who, for instance, can be blacksmiths shall be the children of other blacksmiths, or shall be people who manage to make friends with the blacksmith and make their way into a society of blacksmiths, and they shall be the blacksmiths, and nobody else shall be allowed to be blacksmiths no matter what they want to do or how good they are at it. Guild organization of labor by craft. Weber's going to suggest that that is irrational. It's clinging to a kind of tradition. And sure, it obtained for a long time in a lot of places, but in the eyes of this system, it doesn't make sense. It does not serve the logical, rational, calculating logic of this system to have those kinds of limitations. So a free market means, yes, there can be limitations on trading, but those limitations have to make sense in a kind of logical, rational sense. They can't be grounded simply in tradition or sort of, these sort of rules that don't make sense for the good of producing goods and society as a whole. Yeah? Trade embargoes such as those on Cuba? It would depend how they were justified, right? I mean, if it were justified on the grounds that we aren't going to trade with any countries that speak Spanish and have a strongly Afro-American culture, that would be irrational. If, on the other hand, there's some, if you said, well, we're going to not trade with Cuba because we want to protect the U.S. sugar industry, which, in fact, arguably is, or was at one point, the logic for embargoing Cuban sugar, that would be a rational argument. Any of you experienced irrational limitations on your ability to sell your labor power? Is it rational to you that once you get a degree, college degree, you have more freedom, or rather you can sell your labor power more readily to more people to do more things than you could before or without? Anyone else have any thoughts or questions on this matter? Okay. Third presupposition of capitalism. Rational, mechanized technology in production and commerce. And we're going to talk about this at much greater length a little bit later in the lecture. He suggests that without this, capitalism as it has come to be would not exist. So this is an important piece. Fourth, calculable law. By this he means predictable and rational. Any idea what he means by that? And why is this so important? Why does the law need to be predictable? Yeah. Okay, precisely. If you are interested in selling things, buying things, organizing production, investing in a factory, or signing contracts to sell the things your factory is going to make, you want to know ahead of time that that contract will be recognized as a legally binding contract, right? That it will be enforced. That it will be enforced in a way that is not partial or capricious. You sign one contract that says, I buy this piece of land. I'm giving this person this much money, and this person is giving me this land in return, and now it's mine. You want to know, okay, never mind. You want to know that, in fact, your ownership of that land will be recognized not just now, but into the future, so that you can proceed to invest in that land to do certain things that aren't going to actually pay off until the future, somewhere down the road. You want to know that it's not the case that if somebody else comes along and says, no, that's my land, and the reason it's my land is that I'm the great-great-great-grandson of somebody who owned it or possessed it